Okay, good morning. What I'd like to do this morning before we go further in the text is go back to that discussion that we saw in the Imrei Yaakov about if you make a commitment to someone verbally that you're going to give them a gift. So there is this concept of if you don't follow through on your verbal commitment, you are what's called mechusar amana. You are acting in bad faith. Okay, and the Imrei Yaakov had a very brief discussion that he had said that there are two conditions where if you make a verbal commitment to give something to someone, you may not be in violation of acting in bad faith. The two conditions that he said were if you make the verbal commitment and the person is not there to hear you. So you tell a third party, I'm going to give so and so something. I'm going to drop off a book to so and so, and you never go ahead and do it. And the reason is because mechusar amana is related directly to a sense of reliance that the individual has that he's going to receive something from you, and the disappointment that he's going to experience when he doesn't receive it because the person never followed up. Okay, so uh, that's one opinion. And then also the second scenario is if you make a commitment to a child, because since the child does not have that same level of cognizance to have it, there is there's not the same problem of mechusar amana because we consider a child's mind to be underdeveloped and therefore not having the same depth of reliance that an adult would have. Those were the two conditions. But then he said, but that's one opinion. But there's another opinion that argues that there still is a concept of mechusar amana, even when the person has not heard you make that commitment, and even to a child, and that what the ein lechalek, that you should make no difference. According that this is a rabbinic law that does not have any distinction between whether there's a real reliance on the behalf of the recipient or not. You're always a mechusar amana when you make a commitment and you don't follow through with it. So I just wanted to point out there was something that was sticking in my craw yesterday because I remember recently learning about the importance of being truthful to children. And then I realized it's a Gemara that we had learned that many of us were part of a chabur that was learning Maseches Sukkah together. And we finished Maseches Sukkah before the pandemic. And one of the things that we, very end of Maseches Sukkah, we saw a Gemara that had made reference to that. So I'm just going to show you that Gemara. Let me bring that up. Here we go. It's at the very top over here. It's from Sukkah Daf Mem Vav Amid Beis. Ma'amar Rebbi Zera. Rebbi Zera had taught, and this was in the context of making sure that you don't give your lulav and esrog to a child on the first day of Sukkot, because otherwise you'll lose the opportunity for him to give it back to you, because when you give it to a child, he can acquire it, but he doesn't have the same das, he doesn't have the same level of cognizance to give it back to you. So you may not be able to fulfill the mitzvah. But in that context, Rabbi Zerman said, Lo lema inish liyanuka diyahivnu l'hamidi v'lo yahiv. You should never say to a child, I'm going to give you something, and you end up not giving it to them. Here, let me just, there may be someone who's, if someone's unmuted, if you could mute yourself, please. And the reason is, okay, just give me 1 second here. Let me just mute everyone. There we go. Okay, let me go back. Mishum da'asi la'agmure shikra, because you're going to end up teaching that child falsehood. Shenemar lamdu l'shonam devar sheker, that their tongues learned, the prophet is castigating the people, saying that even your children have learned how to speak falsely. And the danger is, therefore, according to this Gemara. Not that you're acting in poor faith, but there's a secondary consideration that when you lie to children and you tell them, I'm going to do something, and you don't follow up and do it, then the child is being trained to be to learn that lying is acceptable, and not following through on your word is an acceptable trait for an adult to have, and he will model that behavior. So I just wanted to show you that there are a couple of there are many Sfarim who deal with this issue. One of the questions that the Meforshim ask on this Gemara is, well, what about the fact that not only are you teaching a child to lie, but you're also acting in a mechusar amana fashion, that you're acting in bad faith by making a commitment and not carrying through. It's on this basis of this Gemara that some Meforshim actually infer that there's no mechusar amana to a child, because by making a commitment to a child, the child doesn't have the level of reliance that an adult has on those words, because he doesn't have a developed intellect sufficiently, and therefore you're not a mechusar amana. But there's a secondary issue, which is this. Others learn that what Reb Zera is saying is, in addition to being a mechusar amana, you are also doing something really quite horrendous, which is maybe for you, you'll get over it because one time, you didn't follow through on your words. But what about the long-lasting effects on that nebuch, that child, that you have created an imprint upon him, that by that one instance, that could have a lifelong effect on that child, and that's what Rabbi Zera is pointing out. So you can't really infer one way or the other whether there's a mechusar amana from that Gemara, but I just wanted to point out that there's an additional factor, which is that you're setting an example for others that it's okay not to follow through on your words. And I would argue that would be true for any child of any age, and even older children. If they see an adult acting this way, doesn't necessarily have to even be a parent. It's just that if children see that adults can not follow through on their commitments, and that's socially acceptable, that gives them the cue that they can behave in that way as well. There's a sefer called Toras HaKatan. It's a contemporary sefer. It just deals with issues of how to deal with children. And there's two just interesting halachas that I cut and paste over here. And he writes as follows: the year ebichol kocho lahadricham b'midat ha'emet, that you should do whatever you can to raise your children in the trait of truthfulness. V'yagdil lahem onesh hasheker afilu b'sicha b'tela, and you should increase for them the penalty of lying. In other words, impose stiff penalties for false speech, even if there are no ramifications. V'yitaher lahem haschar hagadol meha omer emes, and you should illustrate to your children the great reward for the person who speaks truth. V'yatil aleihem mora gadol be'im yotziu mipihem devar echad shel sheker, and you should place a tremendous amount of you should make them feel moira. You should make them feel afraid to say anything that's untrue. V'chein tzarech laharchikam biyoser mechevras chaverim ra'im. You should also make sure your children don't hang out with the wrong crowd. Kvar Amru Chazal, harbe yalados osa yaldus osa harbe chaverim ra'im osim. That our sages tell us that youthfulness can create a lot of damage, and bad chevra can create a lot of damage as well. Okay, but then if you take a look at the next sif, he writes, Isa bigamara, shelo yomar adam latinok etein lecha davar velo yitein lo. The person should never say to a child, I'm going to give you something, and then not follow through. Mishum shenamar lamdu l'shanam davar shaker. As scripture writes, that their tongues learned to speak falsehood. V'lochein tzarech lihizoher b'ketanim u'lelamed l'shanam ledaber emes below shvua. And therefore, you should always educate your children and frequent them to speak truthfulness, to not swear, to not make vows, that kidei shelo yu regilim lihishava tamid kagoyim, so that they shouldn't say I swear, I promise, like things like that. V'zeh hadavar k'mochova al avotehem v'al melamdei tinokot, and this is something that's really a very significant obligation upon parents and upon teachers. There's an interesting tshuva from a 20th century posek, Rabbi Eliezer Rabinovich, where he talks about, there's a much longer piece where he talks about the stealing of the afikomen. And the question that he has, number one, putting aside the practice of stealing the afikomen, which, is an interesting practice, but he says, let's say someone steals the afikomen at your Seder, and they're not willing to give it back to you unless you promise to give them this very significant gift, right? Which is a game that some people play at the Seder, and we do it to keep the children awake. But let's say adult children do it, or let's say your friends at the Seder do it, and they're adults and they steal the afikomen and they won't give it to you. They're holding it for ransom until you promise to do X. And the question that he asks is, are you obligated to follow through with X because you just want to get a piece of the afikomen? That was the whole purpose of this tshuva. And then he says, so the first part of the tshuva is dedicated to dealing with adults who steal the afikomen, whether or not there's a halachic obligation to follow through on the commitment that you made to them, because is there a sense of reliance on the promise that you made to them or not? But the significant part that as pertains to our conversation is v'zos ladas d'chol zeh kasafti rakim adam gadol gonev ha'afikomen. He says, up until now, I've only been speaking in halachic terms as far as if an adult steals the afikomen. Aval im banav o nechadav haktanim v'hu adin katan acher zar. He says, but if your children or your grandchildren or any other child who's below bar bat mitzvah, they're small children, if they steal the bar mitzvah, gonvim asur l'shakir lahem lahavticham litein lahem bizman she'in bedaito litein lahem, then it is absolutely forbidden to promise to give them something that you know you have no intention of giving them. Kimefurish b'gemara maseches sota delo ema lema inish liyanuka diyahivna lachmidi velo yahiv lei mishum da'asi lagmurei shikra. Based on the Gemara in Maseches Sukkah, right, that we just saw, that it's usher to say to a child something that and then not follow through because you're teaching them to be untruthful. Ella shekame pamim la'achar hapesach hakatan shocheach mima shebikesh litzarach ha'afikomen u'mimela she'enu nichlal begeder la'agmurei shikra. He says the exception would be is many times a child who's very, very young, like a 3 or 4 year old child, is very young, and by the time Pesach is over, they've totally forgotten that they had asked you for a gift for the afikomen. He says there, when the child is so young that they have no memory of the event, so then the problem of teaching them sheker no longer applies, and it all depends on the circumstance. Is there an aspect of teaching them sheker if they no longer remember? So he wants to argue that there's not. But there may be other issues. There may be a problem of mechusar amana. There may be a problem of dover emes bilvavo, speaking truthfully in your heart, which is the midas chasidus that we learned about, the act of piety that we learned about in the previous sif. Anyways, I just wanted to show you these things. Questions or comments at this point before we go further?
Okay, just a couple of things on the very last point. I guess even if the person is not relying on your word, you kind of train yourself not to be truthful. So I guess even that aspect, even if the other person's not, you should always be truthful, because there may come a time when you're not truthful with someone who is relying. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
The other thing I was thinking about was, even if it's not a gift, if it's a punishment you're giving or saying you're going to give to your child, you have to be truthful about that as well. You'd say that if you don't do this, I will lock you in your room for a year. You can't do that because you're not going to follow through, and then your word is not truthful even with respect to
Very
punishment.
Good. Very good. So the yahivna lachmidi, I'm going to give you something, doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to give you something good. It could even mean I'm going to administer something to you that actually may not be good, or you may not feel is gonna be pleasant, right? But you still have to follow through on what you said, right? All right, very good. Okay. Let's take a look at the let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Likutim, following through on your commitments. If a person, we said Shomer Lechaver, if a person said to his friend he's going to give him something, so the Rav Shulchan Aruch had said, if you don't follow through, you're a mechusar amana, right? So he brings down from the poskim that in kibed lechaveru sheiyeh etzlo sandak asur lachzor bo mikibudo, that if you had committed to someone that he's going to be the sandak for your son's bris, then you're not allowed to go back on your commitment. And there's a tshuva from the Chasam Sofer which deals with this whole issue. So first of all, the poskim say that this is only true, that you're not allowed to retract is only after the baby was born. Because if it's before the baby was born, you're committing to something, you're making a commitment on davar shelo bala olam, on something that has not yet come into the world, and therefore your commitment, there's no sense necessarily of reliance, because if you tell someone you're going to be my son's sandak, well, your wife hasn't even given birth yet, so the person doesn't have that sense of reliance. And by the way, the main issue where this comes up is not with the issue of sandak, but is rather the issue of the moil, of if you ask someone to be the moil. The Chasam Sofer, let me just bring it up for just 1 second. Let me see if I can just bring it up quickly. The Pischei Tshuva in Yoredeya Siman Reish Samech Dalid brings up such a scenario where a person was told that he was going to be the moil, and then he gets to the bris and he discovers there's another guy that they've hired or that they've asked to do the bris, and it's a totally different person. So just give me a second. Siman Reish Samech Dalid. Chesmila, Reish Samech Dalid, Aleph. And let's go into the Pischei Tshuva. Here we go. Here it is. Okay. Let me show it on the screen. So here's the Pischei Tshuva quoting the Chasam Sofer. Nasnu la'echad asur lachzor. The Ramah says the halacha in Shulchan Aruch in Siman Reish Samech Dalid that if you ask someone to be your son's moil, you're not allowed to retract. I actually had this case once where someone had asked me to be the moil, and then they had to go back on their commitment because they had a relative that they wanted to give it to, and so had just become a moil, and I had told them, there's what you're doing. I said, I said, as a matter of course, I'll step aside for your relative, but you should know that this is not permitted according to halacha, because once you at least you have an out, because once you make the commitment is binding. So let me just see. He quotes the. Just give me a second here. This is the Pischei Tshuva Yud Aleph. Yeah, so the Taz, in explaining this halacha, states as follows: that you're not allowed to go back on your word. And the Taz says very simply, Mishum she'eris Yisrael lo yasu avla v'lo yidabru chazav, because as the pasuk says, the remnant of Israel will not commit perversity or speak falsely. Umutali kroso Russia, and you're even allowed to call that person a Russia, a bad person, if he doesn't follow through on his commitment. But he says, it would seem to me, however, says the Taz, that that's only true when everything else is normal. But let's say you ask someone to be your moil, and then all of a sudden someone else who's your very close friend or is a much more righteous person becomes available. And we can actually testify that had you known that other person would have been available, you would have given it to that person and not given it to this moil that you've already assigned. Then you would be allowed to, under those conditions, retract. But if you had already given a sworn commitment to the first moil, then you can't rely on that and say, well, that was only because that other guy was not available. Unless you get a hataras nadarim, but if you do get a hataras nadarim, if the guy is willing to release you from that commitment, so then that would help, or even going to a beis din perhaps to get a hataras nadarim would help. The Chassam Sofer says, and this is from the Pitrei Tshuva, which brings down case histories like the Likutim that we're studying. He says the Chassam Sofer was quoted as in his Tshuva Sefer as giving the following illustration: Misha nolad lo ben, the kibud laechad lios moil, the gam taka lo kapo al zeh. So he says a guy has a baby boy, Mazel Tov. He wants to honor someone to be the moil, and he told him, "You're going to be my son's moil," and they shake on it. Labal Yachzerbo, to make sure that there's not going to be any going back on the commitment. Ki Omar shechoshesh penitin hamitzvah lechevra sandik v'ha'ish hamoyel hu dar berichuk makom. So he says, the guy who commits to be the moyel says, we need to shake on this to make sure that we have a deal, because I'm worried that maybe you'll give it to somebody else, and I live far away. So if you're committing to me that I'm going to come and be the moyel, I don't want to have to schlep all that distance and then get turned down. So do we have a deal? And he says yes, and they shake on it. The nasami mikoma. So then the moyel makes the trip. Uba bayom hamila lebeis hakneses l'kayim mitzvaso, and he comes to the shul that morning to fulfill his mitzvah. Va'amnam baal habris eno neman bivriso asher karas samoyel. However, the father, unfortunately, was not a man of his word. And v'chazar bo beini ubeini v'nasan hamitzvah lechevra hanal. And he decided to give the mitzvah to, they call it a chevra sandak. Apparently there was a group there was sort of like some kind of syndicate of moyalim that basically put pressure on the guy, and they said, listen, don't let that guy from out of town do it, give it to one of us. And so he finally gave it to someone else in the local chevra, and v'hamoyel hazet sabach ki kruchi al mitzvaso v'tirchaso ubashto, and the moyel was so upset for three reasons. Number one, you took away my mitzvah. You had committed to me that I would have the mitzvah of doing the bris, and you're taking away my mitzvah, giving it to someone else. Number two, tirchaso, you made me schlep all the way from out of town to come to do your son's bris. And number three, I get to the bris and I'm humiliated. I come with my bag and my white coat or whatever he had, assuming he was going to do the bris, and I get humiliated publicly when someone says, you're not the moil. So the kafats echad mehamorim upasak sheyartiru gimel es hatikiyas kaf lebal habris v'shuvein lachush lechol ta'anois of shalam moil hanal. And so there was a certain Rav who paskined that it's fine, it wasn't good what he did, but we'll give him an out, and we'll do a hataras nedarim, which basically means we'll annul the guy's commitment. Yes, it's true that a handshake is tantamount to an oath in many instances to follow through on your commitment. So we'll do a hataras nedarim. We'll get a 3-member beis din, and we'll say mutter lach, mutter lach, mutter lach. We'll undo the guy's neder, and therefore there can be no more recriminations against the father of the baby. The Chassam Sofer was asked whether this was the correct psak or not. So Dov is already shaking his head. The Heishiv da hamora hazel lo tov hora. He said, and the Chassam Sofer's response that this was an incorrect response to this shaila. Ki hataz lo kasab ela imatza ben kach moyel hatov mimenu delo asik adaite v'chulei. He says because the Taz only gives the father an out if someone that he thought was not available all of a sudden became available, and he's in fact, a superior moyel, or he's a tzaddik or something like that. Ve'atam pasha to kaimelon betray tare les be mishum chusari amana v'lo koi be'aval v'hachanami kutrei tari domi mishum hachi afilu kishenishba yeshetu l'shvuaso dainu pischa v'charataso shematza tov mimenu. And we know that there's no such concept of mechusar amana when there's a drastic change in price. So if you had committed to buy something at a certain price and then the market drops, so then you're not a mechusar amana because the circumstances changed. And the same thing you could say, that was the Taz's whole premise, to say that I committed to you that you'd be my son's moil because of what I had assumed to be the case, that another moil would not be available. But if circumstances change, sometimes you could argue that there's no mechusar amana. Aval hacha de miikara asik adaite chevra sandakos. But he says, but in this case there is no such argument because that chevra, that syndicate of moilim, was already in town, and they had discussed this whole issue beforehand. And the moil had said, "Are you sure you want me to schlep in from out of town? You have this chevra of guys who usually do it in your town. Are you sure you want me to come in?" And the guy said, "Yes, I specifically want you." And they shook hands on it. Les kan matza yoser tov mimenu v'yesh kan mechusar amana v'im nishba ein heter. And he says, and therefore in this kind of situation, it's not like this was not something that was entertained. They discussed the issue of this chevra being available instead of him. And the guy said knowingly that I'm committing to you by a handshake that it's going to go to you despite the fact that I have my local chevra available. And therefore you can't get an annulment of that commitment just with having a beis din say mutter lach, mutter lach, mutter lach. And he gives another argument. He says v'su da'acha shenishba al das chavera v'kibel mimenu tova shitin lo schiras heizehu v'mein heter l'shvu azu ki im miratzon hamoyel ladas Ram Alshikar. He says he brings another tshuva. He says if you made a commitment that if the moil had given you money in order to have the privilege of doing your son's bris, then you can't say, well, then I no longer have an obligation to let you be the moil. He says, and this guy has already made a commitment of investing cash, investing his time and his effort in order to come. So that's even more problematic. And then finally he says, "Va'od teinachim hayamodia ze lahamoil yomo yomayim kodem v'lo gorem lo hotza v'kilo izman lisam imakomo." He says it's one thing if you would have given him a couple of days' notice to prevent him from having to expend all of this. V'su afilo hayadar po be'ir v'lo yilo term yomo v'zeh hayamitbayesh b'rabim achar sha'ola eich yerid v'chalila mizeh. And then he finally says, and the embarrassment also is a factor also. You caused this guy public humiliation. How you were permitted to do that? So, and therefore the Chassam Sofer's conclusion is that this posek who said that it's sufficient just to do a hataras nedarim to undo the commitment, the Chassam Sofer says that was not proper. That was not the right thing to say. And this guy really has a valid time for those three arguments. Anyway.
But I guess you could say that the Moyle wasn't tipped off about what was going to happen.
Yeah, I think I'd rather not say that, but
I just said you could say that.
Yeah,
I wonder whether tomorrow we could explore whether this applies equally to other services that you might engage. Because now we're talking about services. If you say you're going to hire a photographer and then you replace them with somebody else or something else, how does this extend to other services?
It may very well extend to other services, and it really opens up a completely new subject in employer-employee relations, and it's probably going to be found later on when we get to that. But you're right. This all has to do with oral contracts, and when you make an oral contract for someone's services, you're right. Here, it's compounded in this particular tshuva because you're not only retaining someone's services orally, but you've also shaken hands on it, which is tantamount to a shvuah. And also you've given him the privilege of doing a mitzvah, and you're requiring him to expend, and you didn't tell him that you're canceling, and he already booked that time, and he's invested. So there's a lot of problems with what happened in this case.
Might it even be worse if it was on Shabbos, for example?
Of course.
And he came on Shabbos with his equipment and then didn't perform the bris.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos with your equipment unless there's an Eruv. So
I see.
Okay.
But
So there's a lot to
interesting.
discuss.
Fascinating. Thank
All
you.
right. Have a great day, everybody.
Take care. Be well, everyone.
You too.
All the
Thank you,
best.
Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Go to.
Thank you. Good morning.